The morning sunlight spilled through the half-drawn curtains, bathing the small bedroom in a soft golden hue. Claire stood before the mirror, trying to tie the delicate string of her blouse. Her hands fumbled slightly. Maybe from the rush, maybe from the nervousness she had carried all week. It was their 10th anniversary dinner tonight, and she wanted everything to feel perfect, even though things between her and Daniel hadn't felt that way in a while. She sighed quietly, staring at her reflection. The last few months had been busy. Daniel had been working late, and Claire had drowned herself in managing the house and her small online store. They loved each other deeply, but life had slipped into routine. The spark they once had seemed to flicker dimly, hidden behind schedules, bills, and unspoken exhaustion. She reached back again, struggling with the knot of her blouse. The fabric was soft, the tie was thin, and her patience was wearing thin too. Ugh, she muttered, frustrated. That's when she heard the door creak open. Daniel leaned against the doorway, watching her with that familiar half-smile, the one she hadn't seen in a long time. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, tie loosened, hair slightly messy as if he'd been running his hand through it repeatedly. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice gentle but teasing. Claire turned, half embarrassed, half amused. "I can't get this thing tied. Whoever designed this blouse must hate women," she said, exasperated, but smiling faintly. He stepped closer, closing the small distance between them. She could feel his warmth even before he touched her. "Let me try," he offered, his tone soft but sure. She nodded, looking away into the mirror as he came to stand behind her. Daniel's fingers brushed lightly against her back as he lifted the delicate strings. The moment felt unexpectedly intimate. Not in an overtly physical way, but in the kind that reminded her of old times, when silence between them had felt comfortable instead of distant. As he carefully tied the bow, his reflection caught her eyes in the mirror. For a second, the air seemed to still. There was a quiet understanding there, a memory of years gone by, of laughter, of love that had once been effortless. He lingered, perhaps a moment longer than needed, and she noticed. The tie was done, but his hands didn't move right away. Claire swallowed, unsure what to say, unsure if she even wanted to break the moment. Her heart beat a little faster, not from surprise, but from something deeper. A reminder that love could still feel alive, even after time had dulled its edges. Finally, he spoke softly, almost under his breath. "There, perfect." She smiled faintly, her voice quiet. "Thank you." But she didn't step away immediately, and neither did he. It wasn't awkward. It was warm, charged in the gentlest way. It was like rediscovering a piece of their connection that had been sleeping, waiting for the right moment to wake again. The sound of the clock ticking filled the brief silence before she finally turned to face him fully. "You came home early," she said, trying to sound casual but failing to hide her surprise. "I wanted to," he replied simply. "You've been planning this dinner all week. I didn't want to miss a single minute of it." Her eyes softened. For months, she had felt like she was the only one trying, holding the pieces of their life together while he drifted further into work. Hearing those words and seeing the sincerity in his face made something loosen in her chest. "Well, that's a first," she teased lightly, breaking the heaviness. He chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, I guess I've been terrible at showing up lately." She smiled again, a real one this time. "Maybe a little," she admitted. The moment could have ended there, with a simple shared laugh, but something in his eyes made her pause. It was like he wanted to say something more, something deeper. Instead, he just looked at her. Really looked at her, as if remembering the woman he fell in love with, not the version buried beneath daily life. Before either of them spoke, the doorbell rang, pulling them back to the present. Claire blinked, startled. "That must be the delivery. The flowers I ordered for tonight," she said, stepping aside. Daniel nodded and smiled, though the warmth in his expression lingered. As she walked toward the door, she touched the side of her blouse where his hands had been moments ago. The small bow sat perfectly in place, but her heart felt unsteady, like something had shifted quietly inside her. Daniel watched her go, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the urge to follow. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to be close to her again. He didn't know what had changed in those few seconds, but it felt real, something worth holding on to. When Claire opened the door, the cool evening air brushed against her face. She smiled politely at the delivery guy, thanked him, and closed the door behind her. But her thoughts weren't on the flowers. They were on Daniel, on how his touch, his presence, his words had made her heart flutter like it hadn't in years. The house was quiet when she turned back toward the hallway, carrying the vase. Daniel stood there watching her, and the look in his eyes said everything words couldn't. For the first time in a long while, Claire felt seen. And she didn't know if the night ahead would fix everything between them, but she knew one thing for sure. Something had begun to change. As she placed the flowers on the table and adjusted them, Daniel came up behind her again, quietly, naturally. "Claire," he said softly, "I missed you." She turned, her eyes meeting his. There was a tremble in her breath as she answered, "Then don't miss me anymore." It wasn't a grand gesture or dramatic moment, just two people standing close, realizing that love wasn't gone. It had only been waiting, quietly, for them to notice again. And that simple exchange, that quiet honesty, was enough to make the air between them feel new again. The night hadn't even started yet, but already, something deep inside Claire told her, this anniversary wouldn't be like any other. The evening arrived with a calm breeze and the faint scent of rain in the air. Claire stood in the kitchen, checking the oven while glancing occasionally at the clock. Everything was ready. The table was set. Candles waited to be lit. Soft music hummed from the living room. She wanted the night to be special, not fancy or perfect, just meaningful. After so many quiet, distant months, tonight felt like a chance to start over. Daniel had gone upstairs to change, and she could hear the faint sound of his footsteps above. That simple sound made her smile. It had been too long since his presence had felt comforting rather than routine. She brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, looking around the house. Everything seemed warmer tonight, even the light felt softer, as if the world knew this night mattered. When Daniel finally came downstairs, Claire's breath caught for a second. He was wearing the dark blue shirt she had bought for him 2 years ago, the one he used to wear when they'd go out on weekends. She remembered teasing him about how it brought out the color in his eyes. Seeing him in it again made something in her chest tighten, not from sadness, but from a sudden rush of old affection. He smiled shyly, holding out a small box wrapped in silver paper. "I didn't have time for something fancy," he said, "but I thought this might make you smile." Claire took it carefully, her heart already melting at the gesture. Inside was a tiny gold locket, simple, classic, engraved with their initials. When she opened it, there was a tiny picture of them from their wedding day. She remembered that photo. She had been laughing, and Daniel had been looking at her like she was the only thing in the world. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "You remembered this picture," he nodded. "I never forgot. I just stopped looking at it for a while." His honesty hit her harder than she expected. She blinked quickly, smiling to keep her emotions steady. "Well," she said softly, "maybe tonight we can start looking again." Daniel's expression softened. "I'd like that." They sat down to eat, and for the first time in months, conversation flowed easily. They talked about everything and nothing. Work, the neighbors, old friends, the trip they'd never taken. There was laughter, the kind that didn't feel forced. Every glance across the table carried more meaning than words could hold. At one point, Claire noticed Daniel watching her as she spoke. He wasn't distracted or distant. He was fully there. It reminded her of when they were younger, before life had become so tangled with responsibility. It felt like she was being seen again, not as someone's wife, but as herself. After dinner, Daniel poured them each a glass of wine. They moved to the living room, where the candles flickered softly on the coffee table. Claire sat down, pulling her legs beneath her, and Daniel took the spot beside her. the warmth of the firelight wrapped around them like a quiet promise. They sat in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that feels full instead of empty. Then Daniel spoke quietly. "I've been thinking about us, Claire. About how easy it is to forget what really matters." She looked at him, waiting. "I've been so busy trying to make things work, at the office, financially, everything, that I didn't see how I was losing touch with the one thing that made all of it worth it." He paused, his voice low but steady. "You." Claire's throat tightened. She had dreamed of hearing words like that for so long, but now that they came, they felt almost unreal. "I know I wasn't easy to live with either," she admitted. "Sometimes I felt like I was competing with everything else in your life. Work, deadlines, the next big deal. I stopped asking for your time because I didn't want to be disappointed." Daniel nodded slowly. "And I thought you stopped needing me, that you didn't care if I came home late." She laughed softly, not from amusement, but from disbelief at how they'd both misunderstood each other. "We really built walls without even noticing, didn't we?" He looked at her, his expression tender. "Yeah, but maybe we can take them down, one evening at a time." The simplicity of his words touched her. It wasn't a grand speech or a sudden revelation. It was honest, and that honesty was what she had missed most. They sat there, close but not quite touching, the firelight dancing across their faces. Claire could feel her heart slowly softening, the years of quiet distance fading with each shared word. Then, as if drawn by instinct, Daniel reached out and adjusted the gold locket still hanging around her neck. His fingers brushed lightly against her collarbone, and she stilled, surprised by how much that small touch affected her. There was no rush in the movement, just care. Gentle, familiar, safe. "Perfect," he murmured. She looked up at him, her eyes glistening under the dim light. "You always used to say that," she said softly. "Every time you helped me with something, you'd finish with that word." He smiled faintly. "Maybe because you always were." For a few seconds, they just looked at each other, and the space between them seemed to dissolve. It wasn't about passion or longing. It was about remembering how love felt when it was pure, when it didn't need grand gestures to exist. The clock ticked quietly. The wind brushed against the windows, and Claire leaned her head slightly toward him. Daniel hesitated, not because of uncertainty, but because the moment felt fragile, precious. Then he placed his hand over hers, and she didn't pull away. They sat like that. No words, no need for any. Just the quiet hum of two hearts finding rhythm again. After a long pause, Claire whispered, "I don't know what tomorrow will look like, but tonight, this feels right." Daniel nodded, his voice low. "It feels like us again." The air around them seemed lighter, the house no longer filled with silence, but with something softer. Hope. As the night stretched on, they talked more, not about problems, but about dreams. The ones they had left behind, the ones they still wanted to chase. By the time the candles burned low, it felt like a small piece of their old magic had returned. Before they went to bed, Claire turned off the last light, glancing once more at the locket shining faintly in the dark. For the first time in years, she felt peace, not because everything was fixed, but because they were finally facing it together. And as she lay down beside Daniel, their hands brushing under the blanket, she realized something simple yet powerful. Sometimes love doesn't fade. It just waits for you to notice it again. The next morning, the soft light of dawn slipped through the curtains, painting the room in pale gold. Claire stirred awake first. She turned slightly, her eyes finding Daniel still asleep beside her. It felt strange, in a comforting way, to see him there so peacefully. For months, they had lived like two people sharing a roof, but not a life. Yet now, after one honest evening, something inside her felt lighter. She quietly got out of bed and walked to the kitchen. The smell of coffee soon filled the house, mixing with the faint scent of rain from outside. It was a Saturday. No work, no rush. Just quiet. She looked out the window at their small garden and smiled to herself. The world seemed slower, softer, as if it was giving them space to breathe. Daniel walked in a few minutes later, still in his t-shirt, his hair slightly tousled. "Morning," he said, voice low and warm. "Morning," she replied, handing him a mug. They didn't need many words. There was a calm between them, a kind that didn't need to be explained. They sat at the table, sipping coffee, listening to the rain tapping gently against the glass. It felt like the world outside was pausing just for them. After a while, Daniel leaned back and said, "You know what I was thinking? Maybe we should go somewhere, just us. No work, no phones, no noise." Claire looked up, surprised but intrigued. "Where?" "Doesn't matter. Somewhere quiet. Maybe up north, a cabin by the lake. You used to love those trips." She smiled, remembering the summers they used to spend near Lake Tahoe, hiking during the day and sitting by the fire at night. "You think we can just take off like that?" she asked. He grinned. "Why not? I'll clear my schedule. You deserve a break. We both do." Her heart lifted at the idea. It had been years since they'd done something spontaneous together. "Okay," she said softly. "Let's do it." 3 days later, they were driving through winding mountain roads, the trees glowing in shades of orange and gold. The trip felt like stepping out of their regular lives. No emails, no deadlines, no noise. Just the sound of music playing low and the steady rhythm of the car against the road. Claire glanced at Daniel as he drove, one hand on the wheel, the other resting loosely on the console. He looked more relaxed than she'd seen him in months. The deep lines of worry that usually marked his face seemed to have softened. When they finally reached the cabin, it was exactly what they needed. Small, wooden, surrounded by trees and silence. There was a porch overlooking the lake where the water shimmered like glass. Claire stood there, breathing in the clean air, feeling her thoughts quiet down. That evening, as the sun began to set, they sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, watching the sky change colors. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Daniel nodded. "It really is. I forgot how much I missed this." "You used to say this place felt like freedom," she said, smiling faintly. He looked at her, his eyes soft. "It still does, especially right now." The breeze carried the sound of water gently lapping against the shore. For a long time, neither of them spoke. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was peaceful. Like both of them were slowly remembering what it felt like to just be together. Later that night, inside the cabin, they cooked dinner side by side. Claire chopped vegetables while Daniel stirred the pot, making jokes that made her laugh the way she used to. When the food was done, they sat down to eat by candlelight, not for romance, but because the power flickered from the storm outside. The candlelight gave everything a warm glow, and in that glow, Daniel reached across the table, taking her hand. "I forgot what this felt like," he said quietly. She met his gaze, understanding exactly what he meant. "I did too," he hesitated, his voice dropping lower. "I know I haven't always been there the way I should have been. I kept telling myself I was doing it all for us, the work, the hours, the stress. But somewhere along the way, I stopped being with you." Claire's eyes softened. "I know, I stopped trying too. I think I convinced myself that you didn't need me anymore." He squeezed her hand gently. "I've always needed you." The sincerity in his voice broke through every wall she had built. It wasn't about promises or apologies. It was about finally saying the truth. When the storm outside grew louder, thunder rolling across the lake, Claire got up to check the windows. Rain splattered against the glass, and in the dim light, Daniel came up behind her, his hand brushing against her arm as he helped secure the latch. For a brief moment their eyes met, and the air between them grew still again, full of warmth, full of unspoken emotion. It wasn't passion or desire that filled the space. It was something quieter, deeper, connection. A reminder of what they'd always had, but forgotten how to hold. Daniel stepped back and smiled softly. "We make a pretty good team," he said. Claire chuckled. "We always did. We just lost our rhythm." "Then maybe it's time to find it again," he said. They stayed up late, talking and laughing. sharing memories from the early years of their marriage. The small apartment they started in, their first road trip, the burnt lasagna disaster they still joked about. It felt like time folded back on itself, pulling them closer with every shared story. When they finally went to bed, the storm had calmed, replaced by the steady rhythm of rain tapping on the roof. Lying there, Claire felt something she hadn't in years. Safe, loved and understood, Daniel whispered, almost as if afraid to break the quiet. "You know, I didn't realize how much I missed hearing you laugh." She smiled, eyes closed. "Then don't forget it again." He didn't reply, but his hand found hers in the dark, fingers intertwining like they had 1,000 times before. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was simple, real, the kind of closeness that doesn't need to be explained. As the night deepened, Claire's thoughts drifted. She thought about how easily they could have lost this, how close they had come to becoming strangers under the same roof. But somehow, through honesty, effort, and the smallest gestures, they had found their way back. Outside, the rain slowed to a gentle drizzle. The lake shimmered faintly in the moonlight. Inside, two hearts, once distant, now beat in quiet rhythm again, not with perfection, but with hope. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough. The next morning, the storm had passed. The lake was calm again, shining like glass beneath a pale blue sky. Claire stepped outside onto the porch, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. The air was fresh and cool, filled with the scent of wet pine and earth. She took a slow breath and smiled faintly, watching the ripples on the water. For the first time in years, she felt still inside. Not anxious, not rushed, just peaceful. Daniel joined her a few minutes later, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "You're up early," he said, handing her one. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted. "The air feels different today." He leaned on the porch railing beside her, looking out at the same view. "It does," he said. "It feels like we hit the reset button." They stood quietly for a while, sipping their coffee. The only sound was the soft breeze brushing through the trees. Claire glanced at him. His profile against the morning light, the gentle lines near his eyes that she used to trace with her fingers. There was something familiar and new about him at the same time. After breakfast, they decided to take a walk along the lake. The path was muddy from the rain, but they didn't care. They laughed about their shoes sinking into the ground, teasing each other the way they used to. It wasn't grand or dramatic, just easy. 2 people rediscovering a rhythm they thought they'd lost. As they walked, Daniel suddenly stopped. "Claire," he said quietly, "can I ask you something?" She turned, curious. "Of course." He looked at her, serious now. "Do you think we can really fix this? Not just feel good for a few days, but actually make it work again?" His honesty made her pause. She took a deep breath. "I think love isn't something you fix once and forget about," she said softly. "It's something you keep choosing, even when it's hard, especially then." Daniel nodded slowly, taking in her words. "Then I want to choose it," he said. "I want to choose us." Her throat tightened, emotion flooding her chest. "Then let's both do that," she whispered. They walked on, hand in hand, the air cool and gentle around them. It wasn't a promise of perfection. It was a promise to try. Later that afternoon, they returned to the cabin and spent hours talking. Not about the past, but about the future. They made plans to change things when they got home. Fewer late nights at work, more dinners together. Maybe even that photography class Claire had always wanted to take. Daniel watched her as she spoke, admiring the way her eyes lit up when she talked about small dreams. "You know," he said with a smile, "you've still got that spark." "I just forgot how bright it was." Claire laughed softly, shaking her head. "It never went away. You just stopped looking." He grinned. "Then I'm looking now." That evening, as the sun began to set, they built a small fire by the lake. The sky turned shades of pink and gold, the water catching the colors like a mirror. They sat together, wrapped in a blanket, listening to the soft crackle of flames. Daniel turned to her. "Do you remember our first anniversary?" he asked, She nodded, smiling. You forgot to book a restaurant, so we ended up eating pizza on the living room floor. He laughed. And you said it was perfect. It was, she said. Because we were happy. Because it didn't matter where we were. Only that we were together. He looked at her then, really looked, and said, then maybe that's what we've been missing. Not the big moments, just the small ones we stopped noticing. Claire felt tears fill her eyes, not from sadness, but from something softer, gratitude. Maybe, she said, voice low, maybe this is how we start again. They sat there until the stars came out, twinkling faintly above the dark water. The night was cool, but neither of them moved to go inside. They just stayed close, hands intertwined, feeling the quiet hum of belonging return. The next morning, they packed their bags to leave the cabin. Before locking the door, Claire looked around one last time. It's funny, she said. I thought coming here was just a getaway. But it feels like we found something we didn't know we'd lost. Daniel smiled, placing a hand on her shoulder. We didn't lose it. We just forgot how to hold it. The drive back home was filled with light conversation and soft music. It wasn't about fixing everything at once. It was about carrying the peace they had found into their real life. When they reached home, Claire walked inside first. The same walls, the same rooms. Yet everything felt different. It wasn't the house that had changed. It was them. That evening, as she prepared dinner, Daniel came up behind her quietly. He reached for the back of her blouse again, straightening the tie that had come loose. She froze for just a second, remembering the moment days ago when everything began to shift. His fingers lingered, not out of hesitation, but out of care. When she turned to look at him, he simply smiled and said, "Still perfect." Claire laughed, her heart swelling. "You and that word," she teased. He shrugged. "If it fits, it fits." They both laughed, and then, without needing to say anything else, they went on cooking together. The scent of food filled the house, blending with soft music in the background. It wasn't extraordinary, but it was warm, alive, real. As they sat down to eat, Daniel raised his glass. "To new beginnings," he said. Claire met his gaze and smiled. "To remembering what matters." They clinked glasses, and for a moment, the world outside seemed to disappear. After dinner, they sat by the window watching the city lights shimmer in the distance. Claire leaned her head on Daniel's shoulder, feeling his steady heartbeat beneath her cheek. "You know," she murmured, "I used to think love was supposed to feel like fireworks all the time. But maybe it's more like this, quiet, steady, something that grows when you take care of it." Daniel nodded. "I think that's exactly what it is." They stayed like that for a long time, saying nothing more, letting the silence speak for them. And in that stillness, Claire realized something simple but profound. Love doesn't end when life gets hard. It ends when you stop trying. And tonight, they were both trying again. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of rain, just like the morning it all began. Inside, two people sat side by side, hearts once lost now found again, not through grand gestures, but through gentle, honest love. And for them, that was everything.